On December 7, 1941, Japanese bombers attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Within months, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This authorized the relocation of thousands of Japanese American citizens on the West Coast. They were taken by the FBI and sent to one of 10 internment camps in the western United States. Families were split up, possessions were lost, and a race was discriminated against. In this project, I will be focusing on the debate of the Japanese-American internment, the successes, the failures, and the consequences. The internment of the Japanese Americans was an overall failure because it took away their freedom and compromised the values of the Constitution, not to mention the act was discriminatory. Although some would argue that it was for the protection of the American borders and its people. On December 8, 1941, the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States government declared war on Japan, the native country to over 120,000 Japanese Americans. Almost instantly, Japanese Americans were being discriminated by other citizens. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor struck fear in American citizens. People started to get hurt. Houses were being burned and people were being killed as a result of fear. People wanted the Japanese Americans gone. They were now considered enemy aliens among most of the population. There was fear in the community and in the government that the Japanese Americans were collaborating with their home country for another attack. The government had to do something. The country was in chaos. Leaders got together and came up with what they thought was a diplomatic solution. They decided instead of risking an attack from Japan and of people getting killed and injured by fellow citizens, they thought it would be better to relocate the 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast, not only for their own safety, but for what they thought was the United States' safety. On February 19, 1942, 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War at the time, to designate relocation areas for Japanese American citizens. The order was created to give, quote, every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, national defense premises, and national defense utilities, unquote. The FBI and the Secretary of War were given the power to do whatever they thought necessary for the security of the United States. It gave the Secretary of War the power to restrict, quote, the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave the military area, unquote. Soon after the order was authorized, notices started appearing all around the streets. These notices were instructions. Instructions for all citizens of Japanese bloodline that they were to be relocated to one of 10 internment camps in the western United States in early April 1942. Despite their reluctance, all 120,000 Japanese American citizens gathered their belongings and left their homes. Behind them, they left shops and homes that they had occupied for many years, along with many of their possessions that they could not carry to the internment camp.
3 blocks away from their house, there was a building that the Japanese owned, and it was, like a hall, and they took some of their stuff and stored them in that hall. But they didn't have very much time because all they could take with them is what they can carry, and that's it. The stuff that they stored in that one building that was all theirs, it was completely vandalized. Everything was stolen from it.
Because of their internment, the Japanese Americans were outraged, but it was against their honor to protest to the government of their country. Many Japanese Americans thought this internment to be unnecessary. In fact, there was a minority of native-born Americans, like Walt and Millie Woodward, the publishers of the Bainbridge Review newspaper in Bainbridge Island, Washington, who believed that, quote, the widespread fear of enemy aliens would undermine the civil rights of many Americans, unquote. But other American citizens felt that for their security, the only recourse was to intern the Japanese Americans. In 1942, Congressman John Tolan and his committee from California stated that it retained, quote, a profound sense of injustices and constitutional doubts concerning the evacuation of the Japanese, unquote, and that no other alternative existed. In that way, the Japanese American citizens were given no choice at all in this situation.
There was, well, they had no discussion with them. They were just told that they had to go, period.
As a result of the Pearl Harbor attack, the first such attack on American soil, the government made a radical decision to displace the Japanese American citizens. Here's what the U.S. War Department distributed to the American public in 1943.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. Houses and hotels, occupied almost exclusively by Japanese, were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these.
The government and many of the American people felt that they were doing the right thing in isolating the Japanese Americans for their security. In addition to the Japanese American citizens, there were others who disagreed with the internment, because not only did they feel it was an injustice toward basic human rights, but many felt that this action contradicted the values of the Constitution of the United States of America. Amendment 14, Article 1 reads, "No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property." When the Japanese American citizens were interned, many lost their property and homes, and by being interned they lost their freedom. In Amendment 4 in the Bill of Rights, it states, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated." And before the internment, FBI agents searched thousands of Japanese American homes and seized many of their belongings, violating this amendment. There were many consequences following the Japanese American internment, many of which were long-term.
And so they lost a lot of things. They almost had nothing to start with after having to sell everything they had that they could sell for pennies on the dollar, and then trying to start over again is starting over with nothing.
Many of these consequences were negative, making the internment of the Japanese Americans an overall failure, because it took away their freedom and compromised the values of the Constitution. Not to mention the act was discriminatory. Although some would argue that it was for the protection of the American borders and its people. The consequences of this debated event in history had a long-lasting impact, because I think the American people and its government have tried to learn not to overreact based on fear, because that will result in a decision that could compromise people's rights and freedoms. It could be compared to today's problem with the U.S. and the Muslim community. As irrational as the Japanese internment sounds today, I don't know if we did learn anything from it. When the United States was attacked on September 11, 2001, it took radical action and militarily invaded two countries that were prominently Muslim, something it had never done in its history.